Hello teachers! Today we're going to talk about the Schubert Waltz in B minor. Sounds like this. This is one of my favorite pieces to teach. I know I say that on every video. I do love this piece though. I love Schubert. I actually have a lecture that I've given on teaching Schubert to pre-college students, and it's become a particular passion of mine. I think he's a composer that speaks to people of all different times and demographics, and I'm going to try to contain myself today to only talk about this particular waltz. I think pieces like this by Schubert are wonderful preparation pieces for bigger romantic waltzes such as those by Chopin. Generally, Schubert's waltzes are very short. So while they might be packed with a lot of punch and have some technical difficulties or challenges in them, they're usually limited to only one page or so. And oftentimes that can be a great way to work on a skill or something from the Romantic era with a student, because your commitment is not long-term beyond a short piece. This shows up in many collections, and I will put a link to a sheet music plus list in the video description for you to kind of browse through and see where this shows up. It's on RCM level 7, and for my Illinois colleagues, this is also on our AIM level 7. All right, so what do our students need to know or be able to do to play this piece well? This is in B minor. For some of my students, I think that might be one of the first repertoire pieces that they play in B minor. It's not a composer's necessarily favored key, although relative to D major, a lot of my students have played a lot in D at this point. B minor chords can be a little bit awkward because in your left hand of putting your thumb on F sharp. So I would just want to make sure that my students had played their B minor inversions, either the triads or the 4-note chords if they're ready for that. And then talk about the F sharp 7, the 5/7 as well. And those are going to show up quite a bit in this piece. And one of the big features of this piece is the waltz bass, and a lot of it is simply tonic and dominant. I'm doing that without pedal just for the sake of listening to this. So your students just really need to be comfortable getting from that B minor second inversion triad to the F sharp 7. And I would work on that first with my students. Being able to do the jump waltz, this might be your students' first experience doing that. This is a good introduction to that because the harmony is limited to only a few chords. I would probably have my students learn how to do this jump, or this one, and then practice it with their eyes closed. So find the B, close their eyes, can they find the next chord? Now the way to practice it is to jump quickly, but don't actually play the next note. So like this, or, and for some reason playing it silently helps students really find where they're going topographically on the keyboard. We do have a shift to B major at the end, which is the most magical point of this piece, and a hallmark of Schubert's to move from the parallel major to parallel minor, or backwards. He loved to move from B major to B minor, or A major to A minor, or G minor to G major. It's one of the features of many of his pieces across his output. So your students then just need to be able to do the same jumps with a D sharp on top to make it major there. Once your students have gotten good at that waltz bass with the jumps in it, they need to be able to play it softly because they're going to have to balance that underneath the melody. And Schubert gave us pianissimo at the beginning. Let me try that even softer. It's definitely challenging, and you have to know the piece really well to even get to that point of being able to think about your balance. If your students have never done ghost practice, that would be a great idea. Ghost practice is when one of your hands moves around the keyboard like it's going to play, but it doesn't actually play like this. And then once you've done that a few times, you just barely let the left hand back in. And I would probably do that without worrying about the pedal, and then add the pedal back in. For me, I prefer pedal on beat 1, going to beat 2, and then not pedaling through 2 and 3 like this. Just make sure you're not playing your chords really short staccato, because that doesn't sound quite right either, and that would probably make them too loud. As far as rhythm goes, this is in 3/4 time, so that's not complex. Your students do need to be able to execute well the dotted 8th, 16th note rhythm. Otherwise, it's very repetitive in its rhythm, so just make sure they can do that, and then they should be fine going on from there. The right hand needs to be able to do a beautiful 2-note slur articulation for places like measure 4. Or down at the end, we have them in 6ths. That's harder. So what I would do with my student to slur from here to here is play the first one, rotate up to have my thumb up in the air, and then play the next one. So that you get a true slur from 5 to 4, but your thumb is able to bounce around. If you just practice that in slow motion, students do get it. They just need a lot of repetition on it. And of course, you can use a little tap of pedal to help, but I do want my students to be able to do that with their hand. I think the other challenge in the right hand is making a longer phrase out of these short little slurs. And by the way, I'm looking at a Hinson edition of this, Dances of Schubert, an Alfred publication. And I did look up, because I happen to own a Henley text of this dance as well. I believe this is an older collection that isn't published now, but you can find text editions of the Schubert dances. I looked, and the articulation in my Hinson edition is exactly the same as the articulation in my Henley. I love this book because Hinson has provided us with so much introductory material, including some reproductions of paintings or advertisements, and just a lot of wonderful, easy to read and understand commentary on playing Schubert and a little bit of history about Schubert himself. So I find this to be a really valuable resource. But going back to that articulation, we have a lot of these one measure slurs, or things that are grouped in what looks like one measure, but you don't want your phrase to be one measure long. You want to think of it as longer than that. So preferably in groups of 4, and thinking that the general shape is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. That you're going to have the peak of your phrase in that 3rd measure, and then coming down in the 4th. The most special or poignant note is that downbeat of measure 4. That's partly because of the dissonance between the G and the F sharp. Juicy. And that happens, of course, in major at the end. Different character, and it's lovely, just making that change from major to minor. So I encourage your students to think in longer phrases and how you can group those measures together. One of the reasons I love to teach this piece is because of that switch from minor to major. And I find that this is a great opportunity for your students to have some imaginative exploration and really kind of get into the character of the piece or the meaning for them. And if you ever hear me do my whole Schubert lecture, there have been musicologists who've had theories on Schubert's use of minor and major and what that might have meant to him. And one of the things that they talk about is that Major oftentimes signifies something otherworldly, heavenly, mythological, and that minor instead is the cold reality of where we are right now. So I oftentimes encourage my students to think, what happens when we switch right there in measure 25 to major? Did a fairy suddenly come? Were we transported to a different landscape? Was there just some turn in the story, the imaginative story that we are creating with this piece? And I find that that's a really great way to get students interested and committed to playing it beautifully and emotionally invested. And you can really play around with that as much as you want to and do whatever's right for the student that you have sitting on the bench right there. I hope this has given you a few ideas for approaching an intermediate Schubert piece. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I wish you all the best in your teaching.